The flashlight died on the third try. I stood in the dark hallway with my thumb jammed against a button that had stopped caring, and for a second the only sound in the world was the wind coming through a gap somewhere high in the eaves, and my own breathing, which was too loud, too close, like it belonged to somebody else. The house smelled like pine sap and old wood, and something underneath both that I hadn't expected, something familiar I couldn't name. I pressed my back against the plaster, and the wall was cool through my shirt, gritty in a way that meant decades, not months. And the dark came at me from every direction until my eyes found the thin gray strip of evening light that leaked under the front door. I shook the flashlight, smacked it against my palm. Nothing. Phone then. I pulled it out and turned on the camera light, and the hallway came back in pieces. Coat hooks on the wall with nothing hanging from them. A narrow table with a lamp nobody had plugged in for 3 years. And ahead of me, the door to the kitchen, standing half open the way my grandfather always left it. I was the last person in my family who knew he left it that way. My name is Amber Caldwell. I'm 30 years old, and I write code for a living, which means I spend my days fixing things that are broken in ways most people can't see. I work remotely, which is the only reason I still have a paycheck, because 3 weeks ago I stopped having an address. The porch steps had announced me when I came in, that deep, familiar creak on the second one from the top, the sound a house makes when it remembers you, and I'd stopped there for a moment, one hand on the railing, breathing through my nose. Not sentiment, just the body, needing a second. My grandfather's old house key had been on my key ring for 3 years without me ever once thinking I'd actually use it. I moved down the hallway with the phone held up, trailing my free hand along the wall. The plaster was rough under my fingertips, slightly sandy, the way old mountain houses get when nobody's running the heat or the air, and the walls just exist in the open. I passed the narrow table. I passed the coat hooks. My hand found the edge of a frame. A painting, something landscape-ish. A Blue Ridge winter scene my grandmother had picked out before I was born, hanging in the same spot it had occupied for 40 years. I bumped it, just barely, and it swung crooked on its nail. I moved to straighten it, and my fingers touched something behind the frame. Not wall. Something with edges. I stopped, lifted the painting off the nail entirely and set it on the floor, leaning it against the baseboard. And there it was. An envelope, cream-colored, gone slightly yellow at the corners from sitting between a canvas and a plaster wall, in an unheated house, maybe a year, maybe 2. Sealed, and on the front in handwriting I would know in complete darkness. In handwriting I'd grown up reading on birthday cards and Christmas checks and the occasional postcard from a place he'd driven through on his way somewhere else, my full name. Amber Marie Caldwell. Not Amber, not just Caldwell. All 3. The way you write a name when you want someone to understand it's specifically them. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and my phone light propped against the baseboards. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that. They should have been. I opened the envelope carefully, working the flap loose without tearing it, and inside there were 3 things: a folded letter, a small brass key, and a business card for someone named Thomas Yancey, attorney at law, with an address in Hendersonville, North Carolina. The key was cold and lighter than it looked. I set it on the floor beside me and unfolded the letter. I read the first line. Then I read it again, the 3rd time. I just sat there with it. 3 weeks before that night, the day after we put my mother in the ground, my father sat me down in the living room of a house that had my mother's handwriting on the grocery list still stuck to the refrigerator. Her reading glasses were on the side table. The candles from the memorial service were still on the mantel. The whole house smelled like the flowers people had sent, that thick sweetness that means either a wedding or a funeral, and you already know which one this is. Warren Caldwell, 58 years old. Silver hair he kept styled even that week, even at the cemetery. He sat across from me in the armchair that had been my mother's, and he said he needed a fresh start. I heard Brooke in the kitchen before I saw her. The sound of cabinets opening, the kind of opening that isn't looking for something so much as it's deciding where things are going to go from now on. My father said, "Amber, honey, you're 30 years old. You can stay with a friend for a little while. You'll be fine." I asked about the savings account, the one I'd been putting money into since I was 22, the one I'd opened when I was still in college because my father had said it would be smart to have a joint account. He'd help me manage it. And I'd been 22 and I believed him. 8 years of deposits. Every month, automatic, a portion of every paycheck going in without my touching it. I asked about that account and my father said he'd consolidated things. I opened the banking app on my phone right there in the living room with the memorial flowers still going soft on the mantle and looked at the balance. 0. My hands went still in my lap. Not slow, just still, the way a program stops when it hits something it wasn't built to handle. The room kept being the room. My father kept being my father. Brooke was still in the kitchen, and the cabinets were still opening and closing, and I sat there with my phone face up in my hands, and I did not cry. I went upstairs and packed one suitcase. The 2 nights after that, I slept in my car, parked in the lot of a 24-hour gym I had a membership to, because the bathrooms were clean and nobody asked questions before 6 in the morning. A coworker's couch for 4 nights after that. Then a motel off I-40 for $10 a night, more than I could afford, where I sat on the bed with my laptop open and did my job as though nothing had happened. Because the job was the one thing I could not lose. I called the bank. The account had been joint since I opened it, and joint means either party can withdraw, and legally there was nothing to do. I knew that before I called. I called anyway because there's a version of yourself that needs to hear the door close before she'll stop trying the handle. It took me 3 weeks to remember the house key. I don't know why it took that long. Maybe I didn't want to walk into that empty house and feel how much I was starting over. But the motel card was about to be charged again, and I was sitting in a parking lot in the foothills with my keyring in my hand. And there it was, brass, worn smooth on one side from years of pockets. I drove west until the road got narrow and the trees got tall and the Blue Ridge came up around me like something that had been waiting. Now I sat on the kitchen floor of my dead grandfather's house and read his letter by the light of my phone. His voice came through the page the way it always had, plain and direct, like a man who decided years ago that he didn't have enough time to waste on saying things sideways. He wrote about my mother. He wrote about Ruth, my grandmother, who died when I was 6, whom I mostly knew through photographs and the stories he'd never tired of telling. He wrote that the key in the envelope opened a safe deposit box at a bank called Blue Ridge Savings in Hendersonville. He wrote that I should call Thomas Yancey before I went there. He wrote that Thomas had been waiting. And at the bottom of the letter, in the same plain hand that had written my full name on the front of the envelope, he'd written this: "You were never the spare. You were the foundation. They just built on top of you and forgot to look down." I stayed on that kitchen floor for a long time after that. The house settled around me in the dark. The gap in the eaves let in the wind, and the wind moved through the rooms like something that had always lived there. The brass key sat on the tile, 2 inches from my knee, small and cold and light, and I did not sleep that night, but for the first time in 3 weeks, I wasn't running anywhere. I was waiting for morning. Morning came in through the gap in the eaves before I'd properly slept. I lay on the narrow bed in the room I'd cleaned the night before, still in my clothes, the brass key on the nightstand where I'd put it. And I watched the ceiling go from dark to gray to the particular pale gold that happens in the mountains when the sun clears the ridgeline. The house was quiet except for the things old houses do, a pipe ticking somewhere deep in the walls, the groan of a floorboard in the hallway that nobody had walked on. Wind through the trees outside, different from last night, gentler. I'd been awake most of the hours between, with something quieter than restlessness and harder to name. My grandfather had spent 14 years building something and told no one. My grandfather had written down my full name on an envelope and hidden it behind a painting where only someone wandering a dark house, someone with nowhere left to go, would ever find it. He'd known, not guessed, known. I got up, washed my face in the bathroom sink with water that ran brown for a few seconds before clearing, changed into the cleanest clothes I had in my suitcase, and drove into Hendersonville before 8 in the morning. Thomas Yancey's office was on a side street 2 blocks off the main square, a small brick building that had probably been a dentist's office or an insurance agency at some point before the sign above the door was changed. The letters were brass, a little weathered: Thomas A. Yancey, attorney at law. No suite number, no second name listed underneath. The kind of practice that had been around long enough that it didn't need to explain itself. The door was unlocked. No bell when I pushed it open, just the weight of the door and the smell of cedar and old paper and something like lemon polish. The reception area held 4 chairs, a low table with a stack of magazines that were years out of date, and framed photographs on every wall. All mountains. All Blue Ridge. Some in summer, some in snow, one that looked like it had been taken from a ridge line at sunrise, the whole valley spread out below in morning light. There was no secretary. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before a door at the back opened, and a man came through it carrying 2 ceramic mugs, moving like someone who'd been expecting me and had gone to get coffee specifically because he'd seen my car pull up. Lean, with a close-trimmed white beard and reading glasses hung on a chain around his neck. He wore a flannel shirt the color of creek water and moved carefully, the way people move when their knees have an opinion about stairs, but they refuse to let their knees run things. He looked at me with the kind of directness that takes years to earn. "You look like Ruth," he said, not a question. He set one of the mugs on the low table nearest me, still warm. I asked how he knew who I was. "I've been waiting for someone with that face for 3 years, Thomas said. "Sit down. There's a fair amount to explain." His office smelled the same as the reception area, but more so. A single framed photo on the desk, 2 people standing in front of a lake, taken from a distance. He sat down across from me, folded his hands, and began. "Your grandfather," he said, "came to me 14 years before he died and asked me to draft an irrevocable trust. He already knew what he wanted." He'd done his reading. The trust owned everything Henry had built, every parcel of land, every recorded deed, everything with his name on it that mattered. The assets weren't held in Henry's name. They were held in the trust's name, and the trust had a sole beneficiary. That word, soul, landed the way a flat stone lands when you drop it in still water. Me. "No other family member is named," Thomas said. "No other family member knows the trust exists. Your grandfather was very particular about that." He explained the safe deposit box at Blue Ridge Savings, the one the brass key opened. He explained that he was the trustee, which meant it was his legal responsibility to protect the trust's assets, and that he'd been doing exactly that since the day Henry signed the papers. He explained that Henry had asked him, as part of that duty, to maintain a standing arrangement with the county recorder's office. Any inquiry on the trust's parcels would trigger a notification to him. Henry had been direct about the reason. "My son will eventually come looking," he had said. "I want to know when." Thomas paused after that. He picked up his coffee, didn't drink from it right away, just held it. "Your grandfather was the most patient man I ever knew," he said, "and the angriest." I asked him what Henry had been angry about. "The same things you are," Thomas said. "He just had longer to sit with it." We talked for almost an hour. He answered every question I asked, and by the time I stood up to leave, I had a bank appointment scheduled for the following morning and a list of things Thomas wanted me to bring for identity verification, which is when I realized I didn't have any of them. My birth certificate was in the filing cabinet in the spare room of a house in Charlotte that no longer belonged to me in any way that counted. I didn't want to go. My hands tightened on the wheel before I even reached the on-ramp. But my mother had kept a small cardboard box in the spare room closet labeled in her handwriting, "Amber Keep." Inside it were the photographs she'd saved from my childhood, her reading glasses, and a small pearl brooch that had belonged to my grandmother Ruth. She'd told me once it was supposed to come to me. Warren would throw that box out without opening it. I drove east. The house in Charlotte looked the same from the outside, and wrong the moment I stepped through the door. Not dramatically wrong, not ransacked, just the subtle displacement of a space that belongs to someone else now. New throw pillows on the couch in a color my mother would never have chosen. A candle burning on the kitchen counter that smelled like synthetic vanilla, sweet and insistent in a way that sat on top of the house's actual smell rather than living in it. The memorial flowers from 3 weeks ago were gone, every trace of them gone. My mother had been in that house for 22 years and Brooke Langford had been in it for 3 weeks and the flowers were gone. She was in the living room when I came in, phone in hand, expression working hard at appearing natural. Polished, blonde highlights, a blouse tucked into high-waisted slacks. She started to say something and I walked past her without stopping. The spare room was at the end of the hall. The closet still had my mother's winter coats hanging in it, and on the shelf above them, the cardboard box with the masking tape label, exactly where it had always been. I reached up and took it down and stood there for a moment holding it. It wasn't heavy. I pressed it against my chest anyway, both arms around it, and then I walked back out. In the kitchen on my way to the door, there was a business card on the counter near the coffee maker. Not tucked under anything, not put away, just sitting there the way a person leaves something when they've been using it and plan to use it again. Brooke Langford. Langford Realty Group. A phone number and a website and a real estate license number printed small along the bottom edge. I took a picture of it with my phone. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct that lives below the part of the brain that explains its decisions. The number was there and my phone was in my hand, and something about the card being in that kitchen on that counter in that house felt like information. I photographed it and put my phone away and walked out through the front door. And I did not say anything to Brooke Langford, and she did not say anything to me. The drive back was 2 hours, windows cracked, radio off. I thought about a man who had spent 14 years building a wall between his granddaughter and the people who would take everything from her. He'd known Warren would circle. He'd just built it so the circling wouldn't matter. I called Thomas from a pullout on the mountain road when the signal was good enough. He confirmed the bank appointment for 8 the next morning and asked if I'd gotten what I needed. I said I had. Then he said, "One more thing. I received a notification this week from the county recorder's office. Someone made inquiries about your grandfather's land parcels. Last month. It wasn't you." The road was empty ahead of me. The mountains were going dark at the edges. I asked who. "I don't have a name yet," Thomas said. "I'm working on it." I'm working on it. I thanked him and sat there for a moment after hanging up the cardboard box on the seat beside me. The pearl brooch somewhere inside it, Ruth's brooch. A woman who'd been dead for 24 years, still finding ways to be present. Someone had been asking questions about Henry's land. Someone who wasn't me and wasn't Thomas, and had been asking a full month before I ever found that envelope behind the painting. The appointment was at 8 in the morning. I put the car in gear and drove toward it. The bank opened at 8, and Thomas was already waiting on the sidewalk when I pulled up, a thermos in one hand and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like he'd been reading something in the car and hadn't bothered to take them off. He was wearing the same flannel as the day before, or one so close to it I couldn't tell the difference. He nodded when he saw me, the way people nod when they've been expecting you and are simply glad the timing worked out. Blue Ridge Savings Bank was 2 blocks from his office. The teller at the front desk knew Thomas by name, led us through a keyed door and a code panel, and then we were in a short hallway that smelled like metal and recycled air. The smell of rooms where serious things are kept. The vault room was small. A table, 2 chairs, fluorescent light. The clerk found the right row, used her key, and stepped back. My key went in on the left. The box slid out heavier than I expected, and I carried it to the table. Thomas sat but didn't lean forward. He gave me the moment. I lifted the lid. Inside, 3 manila envelopes, each sealed, each labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. Property, history, protection. The same plain print I recognized from the letter. The same hand that had written my full name where only desperation would find it. He'd labeled them in the order he wanted me to open them because that was the kind of man he was, organized, thinking about the person on the other end of the instruction. I opened the one labeled property first. 7 land deeds, each on separate sheets, each notarized, each stamped and recorded with the county, Henderson County, Transylvania County. I spread them out across the table, and Thomas handed me a folded property map from the bottom of the envelope, a printout that had been updated recently, the trust's name in small print along the bottom edge. I unfolded it. The 7 parcels formed a long, irregular band, 345 acres following the French Broad River and curving around a private lake. Lakefront on one end, river corridor on the other, old-growth forest in between. At the bottom of the property stack, a letter on corporate letterhead, Meridian Development Group, addressed to Henry Caldwell personally, dated 2 years before he died. They'd made an offer. $6.2 million for the full parcel, all 7 deeds as is. Henry had never responded. There was no reply in the envelope. Just their letter and the silence of a man who had already decided. "The land has gone up," Thomas said. 2 years is a long time in that corridor. Current estimate runs between 9 and 11 million. I was looking at the map. I knew that lake. I'd been there twice as a child. stood at the edge of it in rubber boots while he pointed at the far shoreline and said things I hadn't paid attention to because I was 8 years old and more interested in the frogs. He'd been showing me what was mine. I'd been looking at frogs. My grandfather, the man everyone in the family referred to as just a farmer, the man my father had written off as someone without vision or ambition, had been sitting on lakefront property worth more than anything Warren Caldwell had ever touched in his life, and Warren had not known, not even a hint of it. I set the map down and opened the second envelope. The journal was leather-bound and thick, the cover worn dark from handling. Tucked inside the front cover, slipped in like a bookmark, was a second smaller document, a handwritten ledger, older pages, different handwriting. Smaller, more careful. I knew before Thomas told me. Ruth. I opened the journal to the first page. My grandfather's hand, clean and plain as always. Ruth bought the first parcel today, 42 acres on the north side of the lake. She paid for it with money from the business. No one knows. That is how she wants it. I turned pages. 30 years of purchases, payments, decisions, attorneys, surveyors, county clerks, all in the same matter-of-fact prose, every transaction tied to a date. The whole thing read less like a diary and more like evidence, which I suspected was intentional, and threaded through the property entries, observations about the family, my father documented across years in the kind of restrained precision that made each entry worse than plain anger would have. Warren asked to borrow money again today. Said no. Warren called Diane about her inheritance share before she'd been home from the hospital a week. There was an entry about my mother's first diagnosis, written in a hand that pressed harder on the page than usual. There was an entry about me. Amber is carrying everything again and doesn't seem to know that's not how it's supposed to work. I closed the journal, not because I didn't want to read it, but because I couldn't read it all at once, not in that room. Not with Thomas sitting quietly across the table, watching me absorb 20 years of his client's private observations about the people who had failed everyone Henry had ever loved. I set it beside the map and reached for the third envelope. Thomas leaned forward slightly for this one. The trust documents were thick printed on heavier paper, each page initialed in my grandfather's handwriting and signed at the end by Henry by Thomas, and by a second attorney whose name and firm address were listed as being in Asheville. The trust had been notarized by 2 different notaries on 2 different dates, which Thomas explained was intentional. Henry had wanted redundancy in the execution. He hadn't wanted anyone to find a procedural weakness. Thomas walked me through it with the documents in front of us, which made it land differently than his office explanation had. The trust owned the land, not the estate, no probate, no family claim. The sole beneficiary was named on page 3, a section Thomas turned to without looking for it, the page worn softer than the others. My name. No other family member could claim the assets, contest the structure, or access the contents without my participation. Your grandfather did not want this to be a gift that could be taken from you, Thomas said. He wanted it to be a wall. I looked at the pages with my name on them, at the signature my grandfather had written 14 years before he died. I thanked Thomas. He nodded and started helping me return everything to the envelopes. I drove back to the house with the journal and the ledger on the passenger seat and the property map folded on top. The mountains were going gold in the late afternoon, the ridges layering into the distance the way they do when the light gets low. I'd driven this road twice now and was starting to learn it. I carried everything inside and set it on the kitchen table. Henry's kitchen table, the same one he'd sat at every morning I could remember, with a cup of coffee and the newspaper and the particular stillness of a man who'd made peace with the early hours. I sat down and opened Ruth's ledger. The first entry was dated 37 years ago. At the top of the page, her handwriting, careful and deliberate, Caldwell Crafts, barn sales. Below it, a column of dates and amounts, each one small, and at the top of the first column, the opening deposit. $420. She'd started it all with $420 from selling quilts and craft supplies out of a barn on a piece of land that everyone, including the people who loved her, had treated as a backdrop. $420, reinvested month by month, year by year, into land that nobody else was watching. 42 acres on the north side of a lake. Then more after that. I put my hands flat on the table. Ruth had been dead for 24 years. She died at 52 of cancer when I was 6 years old, and I mostly knew her from photographs and from the stories my grandfather had told, until telling them was enough to carry her with him everywhere he went. He told me once that Ruth saw things other people didn't bother to look at. I hadn't known what he meant. I put my forehead down on my arms on the table, and I cried. Not the kind I'd managed at my mother's funeral with my hands folded and my face composed. The other kind. The kind that had been sitting behind my sternum for 3 weeks while I kept functioning, because functioning was the only option I had. I cried for my mother, who had known something was there and couldn't tell me what it was. I cried for the woman whose handwriting I was looking at. I cried because $420 is such a stubborn, enormous beginning for something that had outlasted everyone who tried to take it. After a while, the crying stopped. I sat up. The ledger was still there. The journal was still there. The property map was still there, with its 345 acres following the curve of a lake I'd stood at in rubber boots when I was 8 years old. I was still there, too. I made tea in my grandfather's old percolator, the only thing on the counter that still worked, and sat back down at the table and started from the beginning of Ruth's ledger, reading every entry, taking my time. I had time now. That was new. I spent 2 days inside that journal, not continuously. I slept. I worked my remote hours. I ate things from the gas station up the mountain road because I hadn't yet restocked the kitchen with anything beyond the basics. But every hour I wasn't doing something else. I was at the kitchen table with the journal open, reading my grandfather's entries in the order he'd written them, which was chronological and methodical, and very much the way he'd done everything else. Ruth's story came through in pieces over those 2 days, entry by entry. She'd married young, and the understanding was that Henry would work the land and Ruth would work the house. What nobody had accounted for was that Ruth had a mind for numbers and a specific talent for seeing what a piece of ground was worth before anyone else had bothered to look at it carefully. She'd started the quilting business the 3rd year of their marriage, operating out of the barn on weekends, selling quilts and craft supplies to women in the county. She kept the books in that small ledger I'd been reading, each entry precise. She didn't mention the business to anyone outside the marriage because she understood with the practical clarity of a woman who had grown up watching her own mother get talked out of things that mentioning it meant defending it. And she had no interest in spending her energy on defense when she could spend it on the actual work. Henry's entry about the first land purchase was dated 37 years ago. Ruth bought the first parcel today. He wrote it as plainly as he recorded everything else. Underneath it, she says the price won't hold, that in 5 years this land will be worth 4 times what she paid. I didn't argue. I have learned not to argue with Ruth about ground. The second parcel came 18 months later, this time with Henry's participation. The entries after that were joint, each one adding to the picture Ruth had sketched out in her head before any of it was on paper. Ruth died at 52. Cancer, same as my mother. The entries from that period were brief, the handwriting less careful, dates sometimes missing. Henry wrote about her death in a single paragraph, then stopped writing for 2 months, then started again. The next entry read, Ruth saw what this land would become. I did not. I just kept buying because she told me to, and Ruth was never wrong about ground. He kept buying after she died. 14 more parcels over 22 years, until the 7 that remained formed that shape on the map, that long band of river and lake and old forest that a development company had tried to purchase and been silently refused. I turned to the entries about my father. They weren't clustered together. They were scattered across years, dropped into the record the way you document a recurring problem that never quite became a crisis, but never fully resolved either. Henry wrote about Warren the way a careful person writes about a leak they've been watching, with patience, without dramatizing it, just noting what was there. Warren borrowed money from a cousin without telling him it was a loan. We paid it only when pressed. Small entries, small things, but spanning years. Not explosive. Just consistent, and consistency was worse. Then the entry from 14 years before Henry's death. Warren asked me to co-sign a loan today. A business venture, he said. He had papers. I asked what the collateral was, and he said my property would serve. I said no. He called me a fool. He said I was sitting on land that was wasting away when it could be put to work for the family, that I was too small-minded to see an opportunity. He does not know what I have built. He will never know. Today I called Thomas about the trust. I read that entry 3 times. My father had known for 14 years that his own father had resources. He'd come here looking to take something, been turned away, and spent 14 years after that believing it was because the old man was simply stubborn. He hadn't known about the trust or the land or any of the architecture Ruth had started and Henry had protected. The second entry I kept returning to was undated, written in what looked like a different season based on the ink's color fading differently on that page. Henry had visited Amber and Charlotte, was all it said at the top, and then below that, Amber paid for Diane's treatment again this month. Warren bought a new watch. I cannot fix this while I am alive, but I can fix it after. I closed the journal and sat with that for a while. The Henderson County Records office was on the main square in Hendersonville, a county building with parking in the back and a front desk staffed by a man in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Calvin Briggs and had the careful energy of someone who takes his job seriously and is faintly surprised, in a pleased sort of way when other people do too. He pulled the full title histories for the 7 parcels without difficulty, running the searches while I waited, laying each printout on the counter as it came off the printer. He lined them up and stood back, and then he paused in the way that someone pauses when they're deciding whether to say something they're not strictly required to say. "Ma'am," he said, "I probably shouldn't mention this, but someone else was in here last month asking about these same parcels, pulled the same records." I kept my hand still on the counter. He said it was a woman. "Professional," he said. The way people say professional when they mean polished, a certain kind of put together that announces itself. Blonde. She'd smelled like perfume, something floral. She'd asked for the title histories on all 7 parcels and the tax assessment records for the past 5 years, which was exactly what I just asked for, and she'd had a business card she'd set on the counter when she signed in, though he wasn't authorized to share the name. Calvin looked at me the way people look at you when they've said something they're not sure they should have said and are waiting to find out whether it was a mistake. I told him he'd been helpful and thanked him, and something in my voice must have settled his nerves, because he nodded and started restacking the printouts with the careful efficiency of a man who had already decided to file this interaction under routine. He didn't have to share the name. Blonde, polished, perfume that arrived before she did. Standing in a county records office last month, pulling the title Histories on Land that belonged to a trust that, officially, no one outside of Thomas Yancey and myself was supposed to know existed. I thanked Calvin Briggs and drove to Thomas's office. Thomas was at his desk when I came in, not surprised to see me, the way he was generally not surprised by things. I sat down across from him, and I laid it out plainly. My father had taken my savings, forced me out of the house the day after my mother's funeral, and now had a woman researching the title histories on land that was held in a trust he didn't know existed. I told him what Calvin had described. I showed him the photo I'd taken in my father's kitchen, Brooke Langford, Langford Realty Group, license number along the bottom edge. Thomas looked at it, then set the phone on the desk. His hands folded, his expression settled. "Henry predicted this," Thomas said when I finished. "Not the exact sequence, but this. He said Warren would eventually run out of things to take and start looking further back for things he thought he'd missed." Thomas explained that the trust was designed to withstand a challenge. Henry was of documented sound mind when he executed it. The land had been transferred to the trust 14 years before his death, which made any argument about undue influence or late-stage incapacity difficult to construct. But designed to withstand was not the same as certain to go unchallenged, and Thomas wanted me to understand the distinction. "If your father finds out the trust exists," Thomas said, "and finds out what's in it, he will try to contest it. And whoever that woman is working with will likely fund the attempt, because the land is worth a great deal to the right buyer." He let that land. Then he asked me a question in the same plain way he asked everything. No build-up, no softening. "What do you want to do? Not what do you want to feel? What do you want to do?" The answer came up without my having to look for it. It had been sitting there since I read that journal entry, the one about the cosign, the one about Warren calling his father a fool. I want to keep what my grandmother built and my grandfather protected, I said, and I want my father to understand that he lost. Thomas picked up a legal pad and pulled the cap off a pen. Then let's start from the beginning, he said. I went back to the ledger that night with a calculator, not the one on my phone. Henry kept an old adding machine in the desk drawer in what had served as his study, a squat beige thing with a paper roll and keys that clicked when you pressed them. And I brought it out to the kitchen table because using it felt right in a way I couldn't fully account for. Something about doing the math the way Ruth might have done it, column by column, no shortcuts. I started at the first entry, the $420 deposit from Caldwell Crafts, and worked forward through 12 years. Ruth had reinvested almost everything, month after month, drawing almost nothing out. The entries showed what land was selling for, $30 an acre early on, creeping toward $50, then $60. She bought quietly, paying cash from a separate business account, recording the county taxes each year under a line she labeled simply property obligations. 12 years of that handwriting, as deliberate at year 12 as it had been at year 1, and then she got sick, and the ledger stopped. I put the adding machine back in the drawer. I sat at the table with the ledger closed in front of me and Henry's journal beside it, open to a page near the middle, an entry I'd read twice already and kept coming back to. And on the other side of the table, in the cardboard box I'd retrieved from Charlotte, was the photograph I'd found in my mother's things, Diane at 30, holding me as an infant, laughing at something outside the frame. I picked up the journal. I picked up the ledger. I held one in each hand and I sat with the weight of them. My mother had said it near the end in one of those evenings when the medication made her more honest than she usually let herself be. When the filters she'd spent her life constructing came down enough to let things through. She'd been looking at the window, not at me, and she'd said, "Your grandfather always said you were the one who understood." She hadn't said what he meant by it, and I hadn't asked, because she was tired and I thought there would be more time. I understood now. Ruth had started it, in silence, because silence was the only condition under which she'd been allowed to work. Henry had seen what she was building and joined her, kept buying after she died, kept the records the way she'd kept them. And when he saw what Warren was becoming, he built a wall around all of it using the only tools that would hold. Diane had known something existed, had carried the partial knowledge for years and passed it to me as a vague instruction without a map. Ruth started it. Henry protected it. Diane carried the knowledge without the details. And I was the one it was all built for. Not because I was special in any way that had ever been named or rewarded, because I was the one they knew would be left with nothing. Warren had been taking things from women in this family for a long time, and the women in this family had been quietly building in the spaces he didn't look, and they had made sure that when he finally took everything he could reach, there would be something underneath it that he'd never seen. The chain had not been broken. It had just been invisible. I was still sitting there when my phone rang. The number was my father's. I looked at it through 2 full rings. Then I answered. Warren's voice was the same, measured, warm in the practiced way that warmth can be practiced. He said he'd heard I was staying at Grandpa's old place and he was glad I'd had somewhere to land. He said he and some business associates were looking at opportunities in the area and maybe we could sit down together and talk about how to maximize the value for everyone. Maximize the value for everyone. I stayed very still. Outside the kitchen window, the mountain dark was complete. No neighbors, no road noise, just the sound of the wind in the trees. The way it sounded up here when there was nothing between you and the ridge. I said that was interesting. I asked how he'd found out I was here. A neighbor, he said. Someone on the road who'd mentioned seeing a car in the driveway. There were no neighbors on this road. The nearest house was 2 miles down, and the woman who lived there had been in Florida since October. I said I'd think about it and I'd be in touch. I hung up and called Thomas. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him what Warren had said, the exact words, in order. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, someone told him, not a neighbor. He has a contact somewhere, or the woman you described to Calvin told him what she'd found. Either way, he knows you're here, and he knows the property is worth looking at, and he is moving toward it. He is coming, I said. Good, Thomas said. Let him. The next morning, Thomas came to the house, and we worked at the kitchen table for 3 hours. He had the trust documents in a folder, and he went through them the way a surgeon goes through a procedure before operating, not rushing, not performing. Just making sure that every step was exactly where it was supposed to be and that nothing had been missed. The trust was irrevocable. Warren couldn't argue it had been amended or revoked. The land had been in the trust's name 14 years before Henry's death, so any capacity claim ran up against 14 years of tax payments and recorded deeds. Thomas had Henry's annual competency letters from his physician. There was no will to contest. The trust operated outside the estate, no probate proceeding, no public filing. Warren had been excluded from the trust, not the will. A different structure, and one he couldn't challenge the same way. Your grandfather built this like a fortress, Thomas said. He just made it look like a farmhouse. By the end of 3 hours, I had 4 pages of notes in my own handwriting and a clear picture of where the walls were and how thick. That evening, I worked on the house. The porch railing had a section that wobbled when you leaned on it, a rotted post at the far end that needed replacing. I'd found Henry's tools in the lean-to off the back. All of them hung in the same order they'd always been. Every handle wiped down, every blade clean, the tools of a man who'd taken care of what he had. I pulled the rotted post out and set a new one I'd picked up from the hardware store that afternoon, working in the last of the daylight with the mountains going dark behind me and the temperature dropping the way it does in the foothills after the sun clears the ridge. Inside, I cleaned the kitchen properly, scrubbed the counters until the old tile looked the way it had looked when I was small, and this kitchen smelled like coffee and pipe tobacco. I went through the drawers. I aired out the rooms by opening windows and letting the cold mountain air move through and carry out the closed-up smell. In the middle drawer of the bureau in the back bedroom, I found a pair of reading glasses and a coffee mug with a chip on the rim, and Henry's name written on a piece of masking tape stuck to the bottom, the way you label things in a household where objects have a habit of wandering. In the closet off the hallway, I found a box of old photographs, and near the bottom, a photograph of Ruth standing in front of the barn. She was younger than I'd ever seen her, maybe 30, squinting a little into the sun, and behind her the barn had a hand-painted sign on the door, Caldwell Crafts. I stood in the hallway for a long time looking at it. Then I took down the nail where the old painting had hung, the one I'd knocked crooked on my first night here, and I put up Ruth's photograph in its place. The barn. The sign. The woman who started all of it, standing in front of the thing she'd built in the time she'd carved out for herself. The house felt different after that, less like a place someone had arrived at by accident, and more like a place that had been waiting for the right person to come back and open the windows. I made coffee in the percolator and took it out to the porch and sat on the step in the dark. The mountains were just shapes in the black, ridge after ridge fading into each other, enormous and patient and completely indifferent to what was about to happen in Henderson County. Warren was coming. Thomas had told me to let him. I was starting to understand why. 3 days after Warren's call, Thomas came back to the house with a name. He set a folder on the kitchen table, the same kind of manila folder he used for everything, and sat down and opened it without preamble. Inside was a printout from the State Real Estate Licensing Database, Brooke Langford, licensed since 11 years ago, affiliated with Langford Realty Group out of Charlotte. Below that, a second printout showing her professional transaction history, pulled through a service Thomas used for title research, which cross-referenced recorded sales with agent identifiers. The photograph on the business card I'd taken in my father's kitchen matched the license photo exactly. Thomas had run the license number against transaction records going back 4 years. One name came up twice, Meridian Development Group. I knew that name. It was on the letterhead of the offer Henry had never answered. $6.2 million, refused without a reply. She's been in contact with them for at least 7 months, Thomas said. The first documented connection predates your mother's funeral by 4 months. She wasn't introduced to this deal after the fact. She brought it to your father, or he brought her to it. Either way, they were working together before Diane was in the ground. He said it plainly, and I heard it plainly. Brooke Langford hadn't wandered into my father's life and happened to notice a land opportunity. The timeline meant the plan had been running while my mother was still alive. The hospital visits, The absences, the way Brooke had already been rearranging the kitchen the morning after the funeral, moving with the ease of someone who had already decided where things were going to go. Thomas tapped the second page of the printout. She was shopping the deal to Meridian before any legal claim existed, he said. Before your father had any standing to sell, before the trust had even been discovered. This is not a family dispute that happened to intersect with a real estate transaction. He paused. This is a land grab wearing a family mask. I looked at the printouts. At Brooke Langford's license photo, professional and composed, the same expression she'd been wearing in my father's living room the day I walked past her without speaking. I asked Thomas what it meant for our position. It meant, he said, that if Warren filed a challenge and Meridian was involved, the challenge would not just be a son contesting his father's estate planning. It would be a coordinated attempt to acquire land through fraudulent legal pressure, which was a different thing entirely, both legally and in terms of how a judge would read the evidence. He said it the way a man says something he's been turning over for a while, not with satisfaction, but with the steadiness of someone who has confirmed what he suspected and can now work with what he knows. I drove to the county records office that afternoon. Calvin was at his desk, recognized me, and that brief internal calculation crossed his face before professionalism settled back over it. I told him I needed the exact date of the inquiry from last month. He checked his log, ran his finger down the column, and when he found it, he looked up with an expression that said he understood the weight of what he was about to say. 3 days after my mother's funeral, I stood at the counter and let that resolve into something I could hold. 3 days. While the sympathy cards were still arriving at my father's house, while the last of the memorial flowers were still on the mantel, going soft at the edges the way cut flowers do when no one's replacing the water, while I was sleeping on a coworker's couch and telling myself that the worst of it was the savings account, that the savings account was the bottom, that there wasn't anything below it. Warren and Brooke had driven to Henderson County to pull title histories on my grandfather's land while my mother's death was still fresh enough to smell. "Thank you," I said. Calvin nodded. I walked to my car and sat in it for 10 minutes before I started the engine, not because I was falling apart, because some information needs to settle before you can move on it. The process server arrived at the house 4 days later while I was on a work call. I stepped off it the moment I saw the official envelope, signed for it on the porch, and went inside. Warren had filed in Henderson County Superior Court. The complaint claimed that Henry Caldwell had lacked the mental capacity to create a valid, irrevocable trust, that the trust was therefore fraudulent and void, and that as Henry's only surviving child, Warren Caldwell was entitled to the full inheritance of his father's estate. There was a second claim I had to read twice. Meridian Development Group was listed as an interested party, with a note that they had agreed to fund the legal action in exchange for the right of first purchase if the court found in Warren's favor. They had put Meridian's name in the filing itself, not buried in an exhibit, not referenced indirectly, in the body of the complaint in plain language, as though they hadn't considered the possibility that this would be used against them. I called Thomas. He drove out within the hour, read the complaint at the kitchen table while I made coffee, and when he set the pages down, he did something I hadn't seen him do before. He smiled, not broadly, not with any performance in it, but the small, controlled smile of a man who has just watched an opponent step into exactly the trap that was waiting for them. "They named Meridian in the filing," Thomas said. "That connects everything. Their transaction history, the land research before the funeral, Brooke Langford's records. It's all one chain now." And they handed us the link themselves. We spent the next 2 days at the kitchen table. Thomas worked piece by piece, the journal entries documenting Warren's financial conduct across 2 decades, Ruth's ledger proving the acquisitions predated the trust documents with their dual notarization, Henry's annual competency letters, and the last piece, Brooke Langford's transaction records showing contact with Meridian 7 months before the lawsuit, and Calvin Briggs's log showing the land inquiry 3 days after my mother's funeral, before I had been evicted. Before anyone who wasn't already watching had any reason to look at those parcels. Thomas filed a motion to dismiss and a counterclaim for legal fees and sanctions, arguing the lawsuit was a coordinated scheme to acquire property through fraudulent pressure. The hearing was set for a Thursday, 6 weeks out. That night, I sat on the porch with the journal in my lap. The sky was clear the way mountain skies get clear in late autumn. The stars not just visible but present. The kind of night that makes you understand why people once navigated by them. I'd left the porch light off so my eyes could adjust, and after a few minutes the shapes of the ridgelines came back, dark against dark, the familiar bulk of them. I opened the journal to one of the last entries, written about a year before Henry died, in a hand that was slightly less precise than the earlier pages, but still deliberate, still taking its time with each word. I have done what I can. The rest is up to the girl who builds things out of code. She will know what to build with this. I stayed with that for a long moment. He had known what I did for a living. He had come to Charlotte once, sat in my apartment, asked questions about my work with the genuine curiosity of a man who understood that paying attention to people was how you actually knew them. He had gone home and written it down. He had been thinking about me in those terms, the girl who builds things, as though the trust and the land and the careful architecture of 14 years were not a gift so much as a set of materials left by someone who understood that the right person would know what to make from them. He had built a system. He had left me the key in the dark of an empty house and trusted that when I found it, I would know what came next. I closed the journal. The mountains held their positions in the dark. The hearing was 6 weeks out. Thomas had what he needed, and I had read every page of my grandfather's record, every entry about Ruth and the land and Warren and the patient. Angry love of a man who could not fix things while he was alive but had arranged with considerable precision to fix them after. I was not afraid. I was not angry, or not only angry, the way that anger is sometimes not a fire but a temperature, something that runs underneath everything without consuming it, that keeps you steady instead of burning you through. I was ready, and the mountains were patient, and Thursday was 6 weeks away. Thursday came the way important days always come, looking exactly like any other day from the outside. The alarm on my phone went off at 6. I made coffee in the percolator, drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the mountain go from dark to gray to the pale early gold I'd been waking up to for 6 weeks now. I'd laid out my clothes the night before. Navy dress, the kind my mother would have chosen, simple, nothing that tried too hard. The kind of outfit that says, I am not here to perform. I am here to be right. Thomas picked me up at 7:30. He was wearing a jacket and tie which I'd never seen on him before, and it looked natural in the way that things look natural on a person who wears them rarely but wears them correctly when it counts. He handed me a travel thermos of coffee without saying anything about it, which was its own kind of language. Henderson County Courthouse was a low building on the main square, brick, the American flag out front, the kind of building that has been doing what it does for long enough that it no longer has to announce itself. We arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the parking lot for 5 of those minutes, Thomas going over his notes on his yellow legal pad, me drinking the thermos coffee and watching the entrance. Warren arrived with 8 minutes to spare. He came with a Charlotte attorney whose suit cost more than a month of my salary and who carried a leather briefcase that was just worn enough to look established without looking old. Warren was behind him, silver hairstyled, golf shirt replaced today by a proper blazer, moving with the loose confidence of a man who has decided in advance how a room will receive him. Brooke was in the gallery already. I realized when I walked in. She'd arrived separately, settled into a seat near the aisle with her coat folded across her lap and her phone face down on the bench beside her. Warren saw me when he turned from the plaintiff's table. He smiled. It was the smile he had used on me when I was 12 years old and had walked into a conversation I wasn't supposed to have overheard. The smile that said, I don't need you to be angry with me because I have already decided how this is going to go. It had worked when I was 12. The calculation behind it was the same now. The result was different. I looked at him until the smile had been sitting there long enough to become awkward, and then I looked at something else. Warren's attorney presented the case with the fluency of someone who has argued versions of this before. Henry Caldwell. An elderly farmer had been manipulated into a complex legal arrangement he didn't understand, and the arrangement had been used to deprive his only surviving child of his rightful inheritance. The attorney used the word rightful 4 times. He spoke about family as though it were a thing Warren had always protected, and about the trust as though it were a wound inflicted by persons who had taken advantage of a simple man. Thomas sat across the aisle and took notes on his yellow legal pad unhurried, not looking at the judge or Warren's attorney. The practiced stillness of a man who finds what he needs in the record rather than in the room. When Warren's attorney sat down, Thomas stood up. He was not theatrical about it. He didn't pause for effect or arrange his materials in a way that drew attention. He simply rose, moved to the front of the room, and began. He presented the trust documents first, dated 14 years before Henry's death, notarized by 2 different notaries on 2 different dates. Witnessed, filed, recorded with the county, he put copies before the judge. He presented the annual competency letters from Henry's physician next, 12 years of them. Oriented, articulate, no deficits observed. Henry had requested the letters himself. Then he picked up the journal. He did not read all of it. He read 3 entries, slowly, in the same plain voice he used for everything, a voice that did not editorialize because it didn't need to. The first entry, Warren asked me to co-sign a loan today. I said no. He called me a fool. He does not know what I have built. He will never know. Today I called Thomas about the trust. The second entry, Amber paid for Diane's treatment again this month. Warren bought a new watch. I cannot fix this while I am alive, but I can fix it after. The third entry, Ruth bought the first parcel today. 42 acres on the north side of the lake. She paid for it with money from the business. No one knows. That is how she wants it. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when the people in them have understood something they can't ununderstand. I watched Warren. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. The smile was gone, the way a light goes out when someone throws the breaker, not gradually but all at once. Thomas set the journal down and picked up the second folder. He laid the last piece out the same way he'd laid everything else, without drama, each item placed where the judge could see it and understand its position in the chain. Brooke Langford's transaction records, showing documented communication with Meridian Development Group beginning 7 months before the lawsuit was filed. Calvin Briggs's log from the Henderson County Records Office, showing a land inquiry on the trust's parcels dated 3 days after Diane Caldwell's funeral. A copy of the original Meridian offer letter to Henry, dated 2 years before his death, refused without reply. And the complaint itself, with Meridian listed as an interested party on page 2 in the body of the filing. Your Honor, Thomas said, the Development Corporation named as an interested party in this complaint is the same entity that approached Henry Caldwell 2 years before his death with a purchase offer he declined. It is the same entity with whom the plaintiff's associate was in documented communication 7 months before this lawsuit was filed, at a time when no legal claim existed and no court had been petitioned. And it is the same entity that funded an inquiry into the title histories of these parcels 3 days after the plaintiff's wife was buried. He paused. This is not a son grieving his father. This is a man who tried to buy his father's land while the man was alive, was refused, and is now using the courts to take what his father specifically chose to give to someone else. The judge took 15 minutes. In those 15 minutes, Thomas and I sat at our table. I heard Warren say something to his attorney in a low voice. Brooke sat 2 rows behind them with her coat across her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. The judge came back and read her ruling from the bench. Motion to dismiss granted. The irrevocable trust was valid, properly executed, witnessed, notarized, and filed. Henry Caldwell had been, she said, of documented sound mind at the time of its creation and for every year thereafter. The plaintiff's claim was without legal merit and would not survive further proceedings even if the court had not granted the motion today. Fee shifting granted. Warren Caldwell was ordered to pay Amber Caldwell's legal fees in full. The court was also referring Warren's attorney to the state bar. The evidentiary record made clear he had filed a claim he should have known was frivolous. She said one more thing, looking at Warren over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who has spent 20 years hearing people say things that don't hold up. Mr. Caldwell, your father was of exceptionally sound mind. I only wish more estate planning were this thorough. Warren did not speak. I heard movement behind me during the last part of the ruling. I didn't turn around, but I heard it, the sound of a coat being gathered, a footstep, and then the soft, controlled click of the courtroom door. I knew without turning that Brooke Langford was not coming back through it. In the hallway afterward, the marble floor holding the sound of everyone's footsteps at once, Warren came toward me. He was smaller than I remembered, not physically, but something had gone out of him. The particular volume that people carry when they believe their own authority, and without it he was just a man in an expensive jacket walking toward his 30-year-old daughter. He said my name, then he started a sentence. Amber. He started the next word and stopped. I waited. I gave him the space to find whatever he was reaching for, an explanation, a justification, the version of events in which he was still the reasonable one. I waited, and he didn't find it. The sentence stopped before it became one, unfinished, and he stood there with what was left of it between us. He adjusted his watch, the one he'd bought while my mother was in treatment, the one she had never seen because he'd been careful about when he wore it. He adjusted it the way you adjust something when you need your hands to have something to do, and then he turned and walked toward the exit, and I watched him go. Thomas put his hand on my shoulder, just briefly. Your grandfather would have liked today, he said. I nodded. I thought about the journal, the entries, the 14 years of patience, the man who had known he couldn't fix it while he was alive and had built something to fix it after. My grandmother would have liked it more, I said. 3 months after the ruling, Thomas called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was on the porch recaulking the window trim. He said he wanted to update me on a few things, and then he told me about Warren. Not because it was my business exactly, but because Thomas had been doing this for a long time and understood that not knowing is sometimes worse than knowing. That a person can spend a lot of energy imagining what happened to someone when the actual facts would take up much less space. He had a particular talent for giving people what they needed without dressing it up. And what I needed was to know that Warren's situation was real and finished and not something I was going to have to brace for later. The Charlotte house had been foreclosed. Warren had taken a second mortgage against it 2 years earlier, before Diane died, which was how he had been funding the lifestyle that didn't match his income, the watches, the car, the trips with Brooke, the Charlotte attorney's retainer, without the expected windfall from the land. Without the sale he had apparently considered settled before the case was even filed, he couldn't make the payments. The bank moved quickly. By February, the house was listed, and Thomas didn't know what it sold for, only that it had sold and Warren was no longer in it. Brooke had left within a week of the courtroom. Thomas had heard this through the attorney grapevine. Whatever calculation she had been running had been updated. The extended family had mostly stopped calling. The journal entries, when they became part of the public court record, had been picked up by a regional news site covering the Henderson County hearing. And people who had attended the funeral and sided with Warren in the months after had read in black and white what Henry had written about his son's behavior during Diane's illness. The aunts, the cousins. Thomas said Warren had moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Charlotte not far from a highway. And that was all Thomas knew and probably all there was to know. He didn't ask me how I felt about it. I was glad he didn't, because the answer was complicated in a way that had taken me a while to sort out. I didn't feel satisfaction, not the warm, complete kind that stories are supposed to end with, where everything resolves into clean justice and the wronged person stands in the sunlight feeling whole. What I felt was closer to the absence of something I'd been carrying for a long time without knowing its name. The pull to fix it, the reflex that had been operating in me since I was old enough to be useful, the one that monitored who needed what and positioned me to provide it before anyone had to ask. I had been applying that reflex to Warren in some background corner of myself for my entire adult life, waiting for the moment when I might be able to reach him. For the first time, I let the absence of that stay. I thanked Thomas and went back to the window trim. Spring arrived in the foothills the way it always does, decisively. One morning, the redbuds at the edge of the tree line blooming overnight as though they had been waiting for permission. Thomas drove out on a Saturday, and we walked the property together for the first time since the hearing. We started at the house and moved east toward the river corridor, following a path that wasn't quite a path, just the line of least resistance through the old growth. The way people who know land well enough to walk it without clearing it always move. Thomas knew the boundaries by memory. He stopped at each parcel line and told me something about it. when Ruth had bought it, what Henry had paid for the extension, what the county had assessed it at 20 years ago, and what it was worth now. He told it the way he told most things, without drama, like a man giving someone directions to a place they're going to live. We came out to the lake after about 40 minutes of walking. It was smaller than I remembered from childhood, or maybe I was larger. The water was still and reflected the mountains on the far side with the perfect fidelity of calm days in April. Every ridgeline doubled, the sky between them an artifact of water. Ruth's first parcel was on the north side, the 42 acres she'd bought with the money from the barn sales, the one she'd spotted before the prices climbed. I stood at the edge for a while and didn't say anything. Meridian Development had made a new offer, $12.5 million, through a proper broker this time, no lawsuit attached, no interested party designation in any court filing. Thomas had given me the letter without comment. Thomas didn't offer advice. He stood next to me at the edge of the lake and was quiet, which was one of the things I had come to understand about him. He knew the difference between the silence that needs filling and the silence that needs to be left alone. I told him what I'd decided. 2 of the 7 parcels. The 2 farthest from the lake and the river. The ones with the least ecological complexity. The ones Henry himself had acquired last and noted in the journal with the least investment. Those 2 I would sell, not to Meridian. Through a broker, to whoever bought them, at market rate. The proceeds would clear my debts, establish a fund that would keep the remaining parcels' taxes paid for years, and leave enough to endow a small scholarship at the community college in Hendersonville, the Ruth Caldwell Memorial Fund for Women Starting Businesses. The remaining 5 parcels, the lakefront and the old growth and the river corridor, everything Ruth had identified and everything Henry had added to her vision, would go into a conservation easement. Permanent. Recorded with the county. The land could not be developed, could not be subdivided, could not be sold in pieces or whole to any entity for any commercial purpose. It would stay the way it was, the way Ruth had seen it when she looked at it in the early years of her marriage and saw not what it was but what it could become. Thomas said Henry would have done the same thing. I said I thought Ruth would have done it first. We walked back through the old growth as the morning warmed. The light through the canopy had that broken, shifting quality that happens when leaves are still small enough to let most of the sky through. And I watched it move across the ground the way I'd watched a lot of things over the past months, without hurrying it, without needing it to mean something it wasn't ready to mean yet. Back at the house, I found the photograph. I had been through the journal twice since the hearing, slowly, and I found this one on my second pass, tucked between pages near the back, resting there so long it had left a faint impression on the paper on either side. Ruth and Henry, standing at the edge of the lake, the photograph taken from the bank behind them. Ruth was young in it, 30 maybe, in a cotton dress, her hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun. She was looking at the water, not at the camera. Henry was beside her, slightly turned, looking at Ruth. Behind them, the land. Open, unbroken, nothing there yet but trees and ground and whatever Ruth was seeing when she looked out at it. I put it on the wall beside the photo of Ruth in front of the barn, the hand-painted sign behind her, Caldwell Crafts. 2 photographs of the same woman taken years apart. In one, she was working. In the other, she was dreaming. The combination of them was more complete than either one alone. I opened the journal to the final entry. Henry had written it 6 weeks before he died, in a hand that was slower than the earlier pages but still clear, the handwriting of a man who was taking care with a last thing. I finished what Ruth started. Amber will finish what I could not. The land does not need us. We needed the land. It taught us how to be patient, how to be quiet, and how to outlast people who mistake noise for power. I closed the journal and put it on the shelf above the kitchen table, the place where Henry had kept the books he intended to return to. I made coffee in the percolator and carried it out to the porch. The morning light was on the mountains, the particular light of a clear April morning that turns everything it touches to something close to gold. The redbuds were still at it. That brief window when they are more color than tree, when the whole landscape looks like it is trying to say something. I was sitting on the porch step with my coffee when my phone rang. A number I didn't know, a Western North Carolina area code. I answered. A woman's voice, older, careful, The way voices are careful when they're not sure they have the right number. She said, "Is this Amber Caldwell? My name is Margaret. I think your grandmother sold me my first sewing machine." I sat down further on the step. The mountains were in front of me, patient and enormous, and doing what they have always done, holding their ground, holding their position, holding everything that grows on them without asking to be thanked for it. "Tell me everything," I said. I had time. I had this house, this land, this morning in April with the light on the water and the red buds deciding their color, and a woman on the phone who had known Ruth before I was born and wanted to tell me something about her that I hadn't heard yet. She was never the spare. She was the foundation. And foundations do not need to be seen to hold everything up.